Jessica Hopper started writing about music when she was still in high school. Her professional writing career now spans more than 2 decades in a field that doesn't include many women at all. As a pioneer in the field of music criticism, she examines the music of women in many contexts, from songwriters to producers, through an intersectional feminist lens. The 2021 extended and revised edition of Hopper's 2015 collection, titled The First Collection of Criticism by a Living Female Rock Critic, includes oral histories, interviews, profiles, and more. Jessica Hopper has covered wide-ranging subjects over her long and respected career, everyone from Hole to Bjork to Fiona Apple. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. It's Jessica Hopper's story itself that seems as fascinating as any on the pages of her book. I spoke to her from her home in Chicago about the first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic. She said this is a very different collection than the 2015 one. It's the revised and expanded edition. It still covers such a wide swath of your nonfiction, but it is very different. Do you want to talk about some of those differences for folks?
So the collection from 2015, the original version, it came from a different place as a writer. It was really a book that I really felt like I had a lot to prove, even though I was about 20 years into my career, because I started as a teenager. With this new edition, it was deeply informed, in the editorial process of putting it together. It was really deeply informed by what I came to understand in the wake of putting out the first edition of it. I got to go all around the world. I went to 4 continents, 7 countries. I did like 60 some dates in America alone. And at all of these things, I got to encounter my audience and really get to know who reads my work and why, and have a lot of really deep conversations, in particular with young women who were reading my work and had been reading my work, and finding out what they took from it and how it spoke to them, and and what they disagreed with, and all of that sort of right-sided something. I came up in a very male-dominated, very patriarchal world of music criticism, and so decades of writing in that world had sort of distanced me from even knowing my audience. Writing is a very sort of hermetic practice. And so it wasn't merely, the validation, but of meeting my audience and an eager audience. But really, it gave me permission to write to them rather than, a lot of my earliest pieces, including, Emo, Where the Girls Aren't, and even in some ways my interview with Jim DeRogatis about R. Kelly, 2 of the pieces that people really tend to know if they know my work. Those were really, in some ways, really petitioning for men in the music industry to sort of, appreciate women as fans, as participants in music, as, kind of petitioning for humane treatment, be seen as fully human, and for our experiences in music to really be valued. And what I was able to do, come into this book, the second edition of the first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic, coming into the second edition of it, we really got to remake the book with the knowledge of who receives my work in the world. And that was just a huge gift. It was very freeing, and it allowed me to go even deeper into my feminist work and to be confident and unapologetic about it. And it was and that's part of the reason there's more work in it. Also, the other book, I think I was very shy about putting more recent work in my 2015 book. So it sort of stops at like about 2012. But I think in a lot of ways, some of my most important work came after that point. And a lot of my things that are a little bit more historically facing, my interview with Bjork and my piece on the first 5 women who were on the editorial masthead at Rolling Stone, and my interview with Lido Pimienta. And so it was really exciting for me to be able to go back and look at my whole career again with in some ways, fresh eyes and a new sense of permission. And so that's part of the reason that, the previous book, I think, is around 200 some pages, and this one's 450. It's really, I just got to cultivate it anew. And that was a huge, huge gift for me. That was deeply informed by my readers and dialogue with my readers.
Wow, that's so instructive. I mean, it's profound, but it's also instructive in the same way as something that you say in your afterword that I've jotted down, and I wanted to make space to say it here. You were doing an interview with Ian MacKaye, and you say that you were asking him questions that were really covert requests for advice. And something that MacKaye relayed to you was that you have to, quote, keep your head down, do your good work, stick to your principles, and the people who are looking for that work will find you. So then you moved to Chicago and set about basically to live out this idea. Seems like you were young to do this and that you endured a lot for your success. But this is in your afterword, and I kept, sort of rereading essays, rereading some of what's in the book, and thinking about, wow, Jessica Hopper was here, and Jessica Hopper did that, and wondering how much at the fore of your mind was this idea. I mean, this is really a mantra to live by. Keep your head down, do your good work, stick to your principles, and people who are looking for that work will find you. Do you still think about that in 2021?
Oh yeah. And above my desk, there's only 2 pictures of artists, and one is a very young Prince against a wall in Minneapolis, and the other one is Ian MacKaye's band Fugazi playing at the Washington Monument. And so that mantra, as you called it, has really guided me, though there's certainly been times where I was further from it, but it really has been something that I've strived for, in part because Ian MacKaye's band Fugazi was hugely, hugely important to me in showing me that those words were true. And there were certainly times where the critics of my work were much louder in the real world, and sometimes in my head, than the people who were really connecting with my work over the last 29 years. I started writing when I was 15, and I think in some ways those words are, to me, as resonant as they were at 19. I think, like a lot of people that I know that are artists and writers coming out of hopefully the other side of this pandemic and this really intense time, you're returning, I'm returning to really what I know to be true about my art and my work and my community. And so those words really hold true, because I as much as I have to promote work, certainly, and some of that is not quite like keep your head down, but I really know and can trust and believe, because I I've have this lived experience that uh, the people who my work resonates with, in particular, young women and women and young folks in music who've had to really endure a lot to be there. They're looking for feminist histories. I found Ian MacKay's, advice to me to be invaluable and true. It very much matches up with my lived experience of putting out this, the book in 2015, and I found it to absolutely be true that people, particularly in my experience, young women and young folks and women, feminist folks in music, they are desperate to connect with an earlier generation of feminist work, of the experiences and travails of women artists, queer histories, and some of those similar things that I have in the book. And, in part because music culture is inherently patriarchal. One of the functions of patriarchy and, male-dominated cultures is that it seeks to cut off women's, cut people off from an earlier generation of women's wisdom and experience, so that all people who were coming into that scene or coming into, that genre or whatever, they're forever having to kind of start over and dig and, from activist music, reinvent the wheel, because there's just been so much erasure of women's work. And so I think for me, one of my big goals with the book, with the second edition of the first collection, was to put a lot of historically facing work about women and feminist work and activist work within music, and especially the American underground, because if people can connect to that, then they can build off of it.
But you've been doing this since you're 15 years old, and you did so.
Yes.
So I wonder, like, how much of that in getting started and just deciding you were going to push your way into this world was just, you at 15 years old saying, I'm going to do this, and not so concerned about the barriers, just kind of maybe, I don't want to say oblivious to them, because I'm sure there was plenty standing right in front of you, getting in your way. But there you were, 15 years old, without a formal education in like rhetoric or in mass communication. And then you stayed with it, right? I mean, it wasn't just like a little hobby. You did this, until you graduated from high school or whatever. You stayed with it. And so I feel like your story is so singular to begin with, and so difficult. Must have been. Like, that's what I think about. Like, there's so many biopics and so many music documentaries that you can stream now. But I was thinking, like, where's the Jessica Hopper story? That's the one I want to see. But yeah, so I'm wondering about that. Like, have there been obstacles and burdens because of this? Because you started so young, or were you able to just overcome and form like this shield against it in 2021? Like, you're just immune now, And
No, I mean, I wish I was immune in certain ways. So I think my big 2 or 3 influences towards getting started doing this, continuing to do it, and survival through the parts that were really difficult. I have to credit my Montessori education. I was a Montessorian up until 8th grade, and one of the key tenets about Montessori is you learn by doing. You're interested in doing something? Okay, start doing it. And you figure out how it works or it doesn't work. Failure was a phenomenal teacher. And I also, because of that, it's not so much that I was so confident. I mean, as a teenager, I was probably overconfident. Actually, I know I was overconfident about my work, but it was more like, this is part of the process. And then another part of it was coming up at a time, dawn of the 90s in Minneapolis, which had a really thriving punk and DIY hardcore scene historically there. And I knew a lot of people that did fanzines. And I also, the people that I really respected in the scene there, they really helped kind of create a tenor or an attitude, a culture within the punk scene there that even though it was fairly male dominated, the idea is that if you were part of this, you weren't just a consumer. You had to be a participant because, if I wanted bands that I loved to keep coming to Minneapolis, I had to cover them when they came through, or I had to write about them in the alt weekly, or everybody had to do their parts, not just buy a ticket. You had to start a band. You had to put bands up. You had to, help. It was sort of like it was everyone's responsibility to kind of administrate, for lack of a better word, facilitate all of this. It was it was collective work. And so doing a zine, while there were people that were like, oh, she's a gadfly and she's a brat, and, kind of older guys who considered themselves gatekeepers for the scene. And there's always those guys,
Mm-hmm.
and really that was about, as I write in the afterword, they wanted me to, some of that is like, they wanted me to think they were cool. They wanted me to abide by their rules. But more than anything, they wanted me to acquiesce and believe in their hierarchy and their systems. And at that time, I was 15, 16 years old, was right at the start of Riot Grrrl, was, right at the insurgence of Bikini Kill, Bratmobile, Babes in Toyland, a lot of exciting bands from women, a lot of queercore bands, especially coming out of the Bay Area. There was just so much for me to connect to. And Fugazi, of course, that was not the world of these guys. That wasn't these old punk rules of how you have to do it, of the right way. And also I was 15, 16 years old. I fundamentally was going to have issue with basically anything any adult told me. And so that really kind of set a lot of things in motion. And some of these human barricades, some of these, doubting people, some of these people that tried to, circumvent my success or my way forward into writing, into music journalism from the time I was a teen until, I don't know, my mid-30s. I could usually see them coming, and what they would say and what they would do to try to, get in my way or discourage me. It was always the same. It was always the same spiel, or it was just so predictable that I could sometimes just work around it. And I look back now at 44, and I really wonder sometimes, what could I have gotten done if I hadn't spent so much time having to fight for bylines, space, a decent wage, for my writing, for so much of that, that formative time. But I'm grateful for it because I think it really I mean, I think unfortunately, my experience is a really typical experience lots of times for young women in journalism, for plenty of people coming into the music industry and the music scene historically. And so I think that makes, the stories of people's survival and people's struggles that are particularly women's struggles that are um, so much of this new edition of the first collection really important because it helps create for me it's helped substantiate a lineage when the worlds that I work in that lineage is constantly being erased, or not preserved or not held up and valued. And so yeah, I'm not Teflon. I'm not, I think I say it in the afterword. It was like a lot of it was just functional denial, but also some of it was knowing what I'm doing, what I'm doing for myself in this writing is the right thing. It's the right thing for me. This is what I feel called to do. This is my calling. I don't have a lot of other skills. So it was always just what I was just doing what I had to do, just like any other art. And very, very fortunately, I've been successful at it and found a readership again and again.
Yeah, you're extremely prolific, and that's something I'm struck by going through, the 400 pages, and this isn't even all of your work. And the versatility of the writing is something that I'm always struck by. So I honestly think that your book, I'm not just saying this, I've said it to a few people in the last couple of weeks, should be like required reading in colleges and universities because of that, the shifts in the subject matter and the ways that, you address the structure or the focus. Or I listened to an interview with a historian who said that he's prolific because he loves to write. Like he loves history
Mm.
as a historian, but he loves to write. So you obviously love music, but you must love to write, I imagine. And
I'm right now coming back to the the drafts of my next book, which is about women in music in 1975,
mhm,
and kind of daunted by it, in part because during this pandemic time, I have two younger children who are in grade school and have been home with me every day nonstop for 15 months, and so the amount of real writing I got done during that time is like maybe 10 hours. So I'm really right now I was starting to feel some real like, oh God, why have I done this? I tell I was telling my friend Carvel Wallace, who's an author and critic as well, who's working on a book I'm very excited about, a cultural memoir. And I was saying, you're not really deep into writing a book unless you're fantasizing about the sort of jobs you could get or things that you can sell to pay back your book advance so that you don't have to write it. And so I love writing. I love writing, but sometimes the process of doing books, it's like it's the highest highs and the lowest lows of writing, but I love writing about music in a way that, yes, I just love writing. I love it when I feel like I'm kind of hitting a rhythm on the page, when I'm on my third revision of something and I go, aha, that's it. And it's like I've unlocked something in my thinking or come upon a phrase that sort of coalesces something I've been thinking about for a long time. That's sort of like this, it's like having something stuck in the back of my teeth, that you're just sort of working at and you're like, aha, I have it. Okay. And that, I mean, it's like nothing else. It's like nothing else. It's an ecstatic sort of joy for me. And then the secondary joy of it is because, my work is public facing. I'm either publishing things online or in books or, you know, through things that I write for podcasts or other documentary stuff that I do. I hear back from people. I see how my work is received in the world, or, I'm in line at the Chipotle and somebody's like, hey, I read your book in that piece about da da da. Every once in a while, that just happened to be on Monday. So that's an example of it. And I get to be in dialogue with people about music and big ideas and what they believe in and what they hate and what they love. And it's like, I mean, I love talking about music with people. I love arguing about music. So it's just all the parts of it. All the parts of it are really, it sounds hokey to say, but it's just a gift. It's just a gift. I'm so grateful I get to do this. I'm so grateful I get to publish.
It shows in your work. It really does. In my day, there was Cream magazine. There was Rolling Stone, right? I used to think that Cream was probably the magazine everyone really wanted to be in, and that Rolling Stone was still the pinnacle. And I remember my friends and I, my sister and I, read those magazines, and they were so important to us. And we would just like pass around, issues that were a year old or whatever. Do people read about music like that? I don't know. I was thinking about how I feel like with social media, we have so much information about our favorite artists. I used to sit in the library for hours going through microfiche to find like the October 1975 issues of Time and Newsweek to see Bruce Springsteen on the cover and read those stories. And now, I think, I can see what he's doing on Instagram. I mean, it's just a very different kind of access. And it makes me think about like how much I appreciate your sensibility and your experience still with some of these pieces about albums and the magic of listening to an album straight through. Now with music streaming, there's emphasis on the single. And I think about how maybe my generation perceives that something is lost, like what's missing now. Digital natives and the younger generations, maybe they don't miss it. They didn't have it, so maybe they don't miss it. So I feel like there's a lot that sort of typifies changes in the music scene and how this has contributed to your own paradigm shifts in your writing career, and how is it just something that you sort of look at and say, okay, and you adjust, you go with it because you have to, because you're writing about it, and this is just the way the world really works. Things change.
I think that's pretty astute. There's when I briefly worked at Pitchfork, we would just talk about people were less interested in criticism. You didn't need to care about what Pitchfork rated something, because you could go on Spotify or Apple or whatever platform, Bandcamp, and just stream it. So you didn't have to, because it was just immediately accessible. And so in some ways the album review, which in some ways I think is my true milieu as a writer, is just not as nearly as important as it was, as you're talking about in 1972, when there were 4 or 5 sort of big underground music Bibles that people could use to guide them in their purchases, because you couldn't hear something unless it was on the radio, and lots of times things that people cared about just weren't. And there was a lot more, until I would say the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was much more of a gulf between the underground and the mainstream media, music, everything. And so, me being someone who's at the real tail end of Gen X, all my earliest writing was, everything was analog. I would read my drafts. If I had like revisions to a draft, I would have to call my editor and read them over the phone. Or, I remember typing up my reviews and mailing them to my editor across town, or going up to the Kinko's and faxing it. It was really a different sort of, it was a whole different situation. But also, I think now people generally have a different, young music fans have a different relationship with criticism, which is for a lot of reasons. One, younger listeners now, I think, particularly Gen Z, are really skeptical of the music history that's been handed to them. And in some ways, they're more interested in digging in and, searching to the bottom of the internet to find out what the real story was and kind of form their own opinions, which I think is really interesting. Though there's plenty of bands that have no kind of digital record, or are kind of on the other side of that digital divide. And so, that in some ways it sort of flattens history. I think that's one part. Another part is that because of social media, artists do not really talk to journalists anymore. John Carmonica did a big piece on it in the New York Times. He's one of the pop critics there, and about cover stories on big magazines from big artists. They don't really want to be interrogated or held up to the light, and so they have a famous friend interview them. There's generally much fewer music publications in general, and there's a lot less work for critics in general, for arts critics across the board. I feel especially bad for dance critics. And, I think the other part of it too is that being a critic right now, especially being a young critic, I think can be very, very daunting, because there's, a kind of online stan culture, fan bases that might come after you if they don't, if an interview seems like you're asking a question that makes the artist bristle a little, or that isn't purely fawning, or any review that takes any part of the artist's image or choices to task at all. I know plenty of people who've been doxxed by the online hordes or super fans, in particular Taylor Swift and others. But for me, a few years ago, particularly in the wake of the first edition of this book, I felt like I had accomplished a whole lot of what I had, even in my wildest dreams, kind of set out to do in my critical career. And I started to become, one, daunted by having to constantly have an opinion about Taylor Swift or whoever. That just wasn't super interesting to me, because we're in a very celebrity dominant time within music. I've always been more interested in people who've really stuck around and kind of been in the trenches of underground music. Those are the things that inspire and interest me. And in history, more and more in history, music history. And so because of that, how I've adapted, to all of that is that I just got much more interested in podcasts, oral histories, longer form things that were just things you could do in places I could go in my work and my writing that allowed me to write at length, to go much more deeply, rather than going, look what someone put on their Instagram or look at, being tasked with like asking, pop superstars, are you a feminist? Or, the sort of pieces that I was getting tasked with, or endless, I got asked to do just tons and tons of Me Too reporting after R. Kelly. And it was a level of arduousness that I couldn't do. And also I just wanted to do other things, other kinds of writing. And so I've constantly just been moving towards, what's the thing I don't really know how to do? How do I learn how to do that? And I love producing. I love making documentaries. I love making podcasts. I love editing books. I love making books. And part of that is the critic and the music superfan of me is like, I want to read things that are a big idea that go on for 40,000, 50,000 words or half an hour of a podcast or something. I miss that richness that there's not a lot of places for that kind of music criticism anymore. Very, very few. And so I've continually sought that out and kind of sought new climbs with that to pursue.
Who's someone whose music you listen to that would surprise us? Because I feel like I kind of know, like you have very. Well, I think everybody thinks they know.
This is maybe. I mean, this sounds like a total joke, but there were many times during our wee pandemic, during our epic pandemic, where I just wasn't even listening to music. This kind of I think like a lot of people, there were times where I just felt very fried and very like delicate, very tender, and so I kind of listened to the same few things that would surprise no one. Octo Twins, Galaxy 500, some old, just like my old comfort faves listening, Cowboy Junkies. But I got really into probably my number one most listened to record of the last 15 months it's called Wind Chimes of the Australian Outback. And I believe it is a recording, it's like a field recording of wind chimes in the Australian outback. It is an animal landscape that doesn't sound super familiar to me. I don't even know if these are real wind chimes. If they are, someone mic'd and mixed them beautifully. And there's a little wind. And so that's probably the most surprising thing that I love. I found it deeply comforting. Anybody who would have walked past my home office would have been like, why does it sound like, a massage spa in there? But that was my jam. I discovered that I love to listen to I love to listen to wind chimes. Who knows if this will last past the pandemic? I'm definitely listening to a lot more, contemporary music and kind of getting back up to speed now that I feel like I have the temerity, the spiritual bandwidth, the emotional bandwidth. And so who knows if I'm going to keep my wind chimes playlist in deep.
Well, during the pandemic, we all heard about the Linda Lindas, that teen punk girl group.
Yes. I love them. I love that they got a record deal like 4 days after everybody heard about it. You really can't deny them. You can't deny that band.
Yeah. So what do you think about them? We needed them, right?
We needed them. But also, things are happening so fast for them. I'm kind of, part of me is like, protect the Linda Lindas. That energy of the Linda Lindas and their sound reminds me so much of early era Riot Girl bands and, teen punk basement bands that were everything to me as a young punk fan, kind of trying to figure out where they fit in this macho hardcore punk world that I was in. And as I'm so excited for the Linda Lindas and all that they're going to inspire in the people that hear them.
It's really kind of incredible, even in 2021. So, Jessica Hopper, tell me, this is a very unfair question, but what's one thing, if there was just one thing you wanted readers of this book to walk away with when they turn the last page, what's that one thing?
A hunger to go put on some of the records that I wrote about and figure out how they think and feel about them.
Jessica Hopper, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Yvette. This has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Jessica Hopper is the author of the revised and expanded edition of The First Collection of Criticism by a Living Female Rock Critic. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Kathleen Creedon is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.